Welcome to the Holmesian Mystery Vault. Thank you for being here. Let's go on to the mystery.
There are many sounds one expects to hear in London after midnight. Carriage wheels on wet stone, a distant door closing somewhere along the street, the restless wind brushing softly against Baker Street, but the knock that came to 221B that night was not one of them. It was calm, measured, deliberate. 3 quiet strikes upon our door, and when I opened it, there was no one there. Some sounds don't belong to the ordinary world. The knock that came to 221B that night was one of them. It wasn't loud. It wasn't frantic. It didn't beg for attention. It simply arrived. London lay under a thin, restless mist. The gas lamps outside flickered softly, their light blurred by damp air. From our window, the street looked distant and uncertain, as if the whole city were half asleep. Inside, however, everything was as it should be. The fire burned warmly. Papers lay scattered across the table in familiar disorder. Holmes's violin rested quietly near his chair. The room felt settled, comfortable, predictable. Holmes did not. For nearly 2 weeks he had been without a case worth mentioning. Small disputes, poorly executed fraud, the sort of problems that barely required thought. I had seen this mood before. When London grew dull, Holmes grew restless. "I begin to think," he said quietly without looking at me, "that the criminal world has grown lazy." "Surely that is a blessing," I replied, lowering my journal. "For the city, perhaps," he said dryly. "For me, it is starvation." He stood and moved toward the window, peering down into the mist, as though expecting mischief to materialize on command. The clock struck 11:30. Then, 3 knocks, each one firm, evenly spaced, calm. I rose immediately. "There's our diversion," I said lightly, though I confess I felt a faint stir of unease. Holmes did not smile. His eyes had sharpened. I went downstairs and opened the door at once. No one. The landing was empty, the stairwell below silent. I stepped into the corridor and listened. No retreating footsteps, no door closing, nothing but the faint echo of my own breathing. I returned upstairs. "No one at all," I said. Holmes stood and walked slowly to the sitting-room door. He placed his hand against the wood, as though testing its warmth. "Did you notice the spacing?" he asked. "The spacing. 3 knocks, perfectly measured. Not hurried, not careless." "Perhaps some idle youth," I suggested. Holmes gave a faint shake of his head. "Idle youth are rarely disciplined." We resumed our seats, though the room no longer felt entirely relaxed. The fire crackled softly. The wind brushed faintly at the glass. 5 minutes passed. Holmes had just turned slightly toward the mantel when it came again. 3 knocks, identical. Not louder, not softer. The same distance between each strike. This time Holmes moved first. He crossed the room swiftly and descended the stairs. I followed close behind. He opened the door without hesitation. Empty. He stepped outside onto the pavement, scanning left and right. The mist hung thick and indifferent. No figure hurried away. No carriage waited nearby. He looked down at the stones, then back toward the doorway. When he re-entered, he closed the door slowly, thoughtfully. "No retreat," he murmured. "What do you mean?" I asked. "No echo of departure, no disturbed rhythm in the air." We climbed the stairs again. Holmes stood in the center of the sitting room, very still. "When a sound lacks explanation," he said quietly, "the mind is eager to supply one. You suspect trickery? I suspect intention." The word lingered. I felt it then, not fear exactly, but awareness. The house felt the same. The fire still burned. The furniture remained unchanged. Yet something had shifted. Holmes moved closer to the door once more and tapped lightly against the panel. "Watson," he said, "most people assume a knock belongs to the door, and you do not. I assume nothing." He stood listening, not outward toward the street, but inward toward the structure of the house itself. The city beyond our windows remained quiet, ordinary, untroubled, but 221B no longer felt entirely alone. The knock had not frightened Holmes. It had engaged him, and I realized, watching him there in the firelight, that whatever had struck our door that evening had accomplished something no ordinary crime had managed in weeks. It had awakened his interest, and that, I knew, meant this was no accident. We did not sit again. That, I think, was the moment the night truly shifted. Holmes remained standing near the hearth, eyes fixed not on the door but on the space just beside it, as though calculating something unseen. The firelight caught the sharp edges of his face, and I could tell at once that boredom had vanished entirely. "You heard it as I did?" he asked quietly. "3 knocks," I said, "evenly spaced." "Yes." He glanced at the clock. 11:37. "You're timing it." "I am observing it." The distinction mattered. We waited. The house felt suddenly too quiet. Every small sound grew exaggerated, the faint hiss of the fire, the settling creak of wood, the distant rumble of carriage wheels outside. 5 minutes passed. Holmes did not move. Neither did I. And then, 3 knocks. Again, exactly the same. Firm, controlled, patient. This time the sound seemed louder, though I knew it was not. It was familiarity that amplified it. Holmes moved immediately. He did not rush, but he moved with purpose. I followed him down the stairs, the tension in the air now unmistakable. He opened the door swiftly. The corridor beyond lay empty once more. No movement, no retreat. Holmes stepped outside onto the pavement without hesitation. The mist curled lazily under the street lamps. A lone figure moved at the far end of the road, but too distant to be relevant. No one stood before our door. Holmes crouched briefly and examined the threshold. "What do you expect to find?" I asked. "Absence," he replied. He stood again and listened. Truly listened. Head slightly inclined, eyes unfocused. Then he stepped back inside and closed the door slowly. "There is no disturbance in the air," he said softly. "The air, if someone had stood here moments ago, even briefly, there would be a shift. Movement leaves trace, even subtle." "You are certain?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he pressed his palm flat against the wood of the door. "Curious," he murmured. We ascended the stairs once more. This time he did not return to the settee. He positioned himself directly beside the sitting-room door, fingers lightly touching the panel. "Watson," he said calmly, "tell me what you feel." "Feel? Emotionally?" I hesitated. "Unsettled," I admitted. "The repetition is deliberate." Holmes gave a faint nod. "Precisely." He walked to the center of the room and turned slowly, scanning the walls, the ceiling, the floor, as though seeing the structure itself for the first time. "When the mind cannot identify a source," he continued quietly, "it invents one, and invention grows quickly in silence." "You do not believe this is random?" "No." "And not supernatural?" Holmes's expression sharpened slightly. "Supernatural explanations are born from insufficient data." We fell silent again. The clock ticked steadily. 11:46. Holmes suddenly extinguished the lamp nearest the window, plunging half the room into shadow. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Altering the conditions. You expect it again?" "I expect pattern." The room felt narrower now, darker. The firelight flickered against the walls, casting shifting shadows that seemed almost to breathe. Holmes stood perfectly still, and then 3 knocks again. This time closer, not in distance, but in presence. The sound felt as though it emerged not from beyond the door, but from the door itself. Holmes flung it open instantly, empty. But he did not step outside this time. Instead, he leaned his ear close to the door frame, then to the adjacent wall. He tapped lightly against the wood, a dull response. He tapped again, harder. The resonance shifted subtly. "You hear that?" he asked. "I hear a knock," I said. "No," he corrected gently. "You hear vibration." He struck the wall once more, not the door. To my astonishment, the sound that answered carried with startling similarity to the earlier knocks. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Sound travels," he said quietly, "and it deceives." A slow realization began to form. "You believe it may not originate outside." "I believe," he replied evenly, "that we have assumed too quickly. The air in the room felt different now, not haunted, not ominous, but charged. Holmes stepped back from the door. "The precision is the clue," he said softly. "Not the volume, not the hour, the precision." He glanced at the clock again. 7 minutes between the first and second repetition, 9 between the second and third. "You are charting it. I am eliminating chaos." The fire snapped loudly behind us, making me start involuntarily. Holmes noticed. "You see?" he said quietly. "Your mind expects the knock now." He was correct. I was listening for it, waiting for it, and that, more than the sound itself, unsettled me. Holmes folded his hands behind his back. "We are not being frightened, Watson. No, we are being studied." The statement lingered. The knock had not demanded entry. It had tested response. And as I stood there in the half-darkened room, I understood something that made the air feel thinner still. Whoever or whatever was responsible did not wish to enter 221B. It wished to measure it, and Holmes at last was fully awake. The disturbances ceased after the fourth knock. Holmes remained awake long after I retired, pacing occasionally, testing the door, tapping lightly along the adjoining walls as though conversing in a language only he understood. By morning, the house had returned to its familiar quiet. If not for our shared experience, I might almost have believed the matter imagined. Holmes, however, appeared invigorated. He had already finished his breakfast and spread several sheets of paper upon the table when Mrs. Hudson announced our visitor shortly after 11. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. Says it's a matter of discretion." Holmes's eyes flickered toward the doorway. "Show him up." The man who entered carried the unmistakable bearing of one accustomed to command respect. He was in his late 50s, immaculately dressed, his coat tailored with precision, his gloves held neatly in one hand, his hair, silvered at the temples, was brushed carefully back. Yet beneath that cultivated composure, I detected strain. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said, offering a slight bow. "My name is Sir Alistair Pembroke." Holmes gestured toward the chair opposite. "Pray be seated, Sir Alistair. How may I be of service?" Pembroke sat, though not comfortably. His gaze moved briefly about the room as if measuring its discretion. "I come," he began carefully, "on a matter I would prefer not to involve the police." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "That preference is not uncommon among my clients. It concerns a disturbance." Holmes did not react outwardly. I, however, felt a quiet alertness stir within me. "A disturbance of what nature?" Holmes asked calmly. "A knocking," Pembroke said. The word lingered. Holmes's expression remained composed, but I noticed his fingers still upon the table. "At your residence?" he inquired. "Yes. And at what hour?" "Half-past midnight. Each evening. For the past 3 nights." Holmes and I exchanged the briefest of glances. "Describe the sound," Holmes said. 3 knocks, Pembroke replied. "Measured. Deliberate. Not hurried. Not frantic. Precisely spaced." Holmes leaned back slightly. "And upon investigating?" "There is no one," Pembroke said firmly. "No servant admits to it. No trespasser is discovered. My butler swears the door remains untouched, yet the sound is unmistakable." "Have you enemies, Sir Alistair?" Holmes asked. The gentleman hesitated, just enough. "I am a man of business," he replied, "and philanthropy. One does not acquire influence without occasionally acquiring resentment." Pembroke's name was not unknown to me. He was a respected benefactor of several charitable institutions, a visible presence in society. His reputation was one of generosity and discipline. "And you fear," Holmes prompted gently. Pembroke's jaw tightened slightly. "I fear ridicule," he admitted. "You must understand, Mr. Holmes, a man in my position cannot be seen chasing ghosts. If word were to spread that I complain of phantom disturbances, your judgment might be questioned." Holmes finished quietly. "Precisely. And who resides within your household?" "My niece, Clara. My private secretary, Mr. Rowan. My butler, Edwards, who has been with me 20 years, and a modest staff." Holmes nodded slowly. "And no one else has heard these knocks?" "They have," Pembroke said. "The servants admit to hearing something, but they refuse to speculate. Clara believes it merely mischief. Rowan, he paused. Yes, Holmes prompted. Rowan insists it must be some defect in the structure of the house. Holmes rose and walked to the window, his back turned thoughtfully toward us. You reside in Belgravia, do you not? He asked. Yes, number 17 Ashcombe Terrace. Holmes remained silent for a long moment. Sir Alistair, he said at last, I must ask you a question of some delicacy. Pembroke's shoulders stiffened. Have there been recent changes to your affairs? The gentleman hesitated again, longer this time. I amended my will, he admitted. Holmes turned slowly. And who benefits from that amendment? My niece? And who does not? A shadow crossed Pembroke's face. My secretary had anticipated advancement. I see. Holmes resumed his seat. You are certain, he said carefully, that the knocks occur precisely at midnight, to the minute. And only then? Yes. Holmes folded his hands. Sir Alistair, he said quietly, you are not being haunted. A faint, relieved exhale escaped the man. You believe so? I believe, Holmes continued, that repetition at precise intervals suggests intention, not superstition. Pembroke leaned forward. You will take the case? Holmes allowed the smallest smile. Indeed, I find myself unusually acquainted with the phenomenon. You have heard such knocking before? Holmes's eyes flickered briefly toward me. Quite recently. For the first time, Sir Alistair's composure faltered entirely. You mean? Yes, Holmes said evenly. The phantom knock has already visited Baker Street. The room grew very still. Whatever had begun as a private disturbance in Belgravia had now connected itself directly to our own doorstep. And with that connection, the matter ceased to be mere nuisance. It had become deliberate. That afternoon found us stepping down from a hansom cab onto the broad, orderly pavement of Ashcombe Terrace. Belgravia wore its wealth discreetly. The houses stood in dignified uniformity, white facades, polished brass knockers, tall windows draped in heavy curtains. Nothing in their appearance suggested unrest. Number 17 differed in no obvious respect. Sir Alistair admitted us personally. The entry hall was spacious, tiled in black and white marble, its ceiling high enough to lend even whispered words a faint echo. A chandelier hung above, its crystals catching the pale winter light that filtered through the fanlight over the door. You see, sir, Alistair said, gesturing toward the entrance. There is nothing unusual about it. Holmes did not answer immediately. He moved toward the front door with quiet deliberation and examined it closely. His fingers traced the polished wood. He inspected the brass knocker, the keyhole, the hinges. He bent slightly and studied the threshold. No scratches, he murmured. No tool marks. He opened the door and stepped outside, observing the alignment of the frame and the stone facade. You have heard the knock distinctly from within? Holmes asked. Perfectly, Sir, Alistair replied, as though someone stood precisely where you are now. Holmes closed the door and struck it lightly with his knuckles. The sound carried firmly through the hall. He struck again, adjusting the angle and force. The resonance altered subtly. Who first heard it? He asked. I did, Sir Alistair answered. The first evening I believed it to be a caller delayed by the hour. I opened the door myself and found no one. No one. Holmes turned slowly, his eyes scanning the hall, not merely its surfaces, but its proportions. Who resides in the rooms adjacent to this entrance? He asked. My study lies to the right, sir, Alistair said. The drawing room to the left. Holmes stepped into the study first. It was a richly appointed chamber. Mahogany desk, leather chairs, shelves of ledgers and correspondence. A fire burned low in the grate. The desk stood against the wall that bordered the entry hall. Holmes tapped that wall gently with his knuckles. The sound was solid. He moved along its length, tapping at intervals. When he reached a point near the doorframe, he paused. The sound there was subtly different, less dense. He did not comment. Instead, he examined the molding along the baseboard, then the paneling near the door. You have had no recent renovations? He asked casually. None, Sir Alistair replied. The house has been unchanged for years. Holmes nodded and stepped back into the hall. May I meet the members of your household? He asked. Sir Alister summoned them. First came Edwards, the butler, an older man with composed expression and steady hands. He confirmed hearing the knock on the second night, but insisted he had found nothing upon investigation. Then Clara Pembroke entered, a young woman of composed demeanor, perhaps 25. She greeted us politely, though I observed a hint of skepticism in her eyes. "It must be some mechanical oddity," she said lightly. "Old houses make peculiar sounds." "At precisely midnight," Holmes asked. She hesitated. "It is a coincidence, surely. And you, Miss Pembroke, where were you at that hour?" "In my room, reading." "Alone?" "Yes." Her answer was steady. Finally, Mr. Rowan appeared, the private secretary, a man of neat appearance and nervous bearing, perhaps in his early 30s. His gaze flicked quickly from Holmes to Sir Alister and back again. "You have heard the knock?" Holmes asked him. "I have," Rowan said. "It must be expansion of the wood. Temperature fluctuation can cause." Holmes raised a hand gently. "Wood does not expand with punctuality," he said. Rowan colored slightly. Holmes resumed his slow inspection of the hall. He stood before the door once more and closed his eyes briefly, as though listening to memory itself. "Sir Alister," he said quietly, "the knock occurs here, yet I am not persuaded it originates here." Pembroke frowned. "You believe it comes from elsewhere. I believe sound is a most obedient servant of structure. It travels, it deceives." Holmes knelt briefly and examined the floorboards near the threshold. He pressed lightly upon them. "Do you ever use the study at midnight?" he asked. "Rarely," Sir Alister said. "I retire by 11. Holmes stood. "Tonight," he said calmly, "we shall remain." A subtle tension moved through the room. "You believe it will happen again?" Clara asked. Holmes met her gaze evenly. "I am certain of it." Outside, the winter light had already begun to fade. The house stood immaculate, dignified, undisturbed, yet beneath its polished surface, Holmes had sensed something irregular, something not of spirits or specters, but of intention concealed within architecture. The solidity of Belgravia's finest homes was, perhaps, less absolute than it appeared, and the phantom knock, whatever its source, was not content to remain unexplained. Holmes requested that the household gather once more in the drawing room before dusk fully settled. Sir Alister complied without protest, though I could see the strain upon him. A man accustomed to control does not welcome uncertainty within his own walls. The drawing room was large but intimate in its arrangement. Heavy curtains softened the windows. A low fire glowed in the grate. Lamps cast a warm but measured light that seemed to exaggerate every shadow. Holmes remained standing while the others took their seats. "If you will indulge me," he began calmly, "I should like to speak plainly. The matter of the midnight knocking is not a haunting, nor an accident of timber and stone. It is deliberate." Clara shifted slightly in her chair. Rowan's hands tightened upon his knees. Edward stood upright near the doorway, his expression disciplined and unreadable. Sir Alister folded his hands. "You believe someone within this house responsible?" he asked quietly. Holmes inclined his head. "I believe the sound cannot be produced without access, opportunity, and motive. Therefore, our circle is necessarily confined." The word hung in the air. "A circle," Clara repeated. "Yes," Holmes said, "a closed circle. Those who reside here or possess free entry." He began to pace slowly, not dramatically, but thoughtfully. "Sir Alister," he said, turning first to our host, "you are a man of means and public standing. Your reputation is an asset of considerable value. Any suggestion of instability could invite scrutiny. Would you agree?" Sir Alister's jaw tightened. "I would." Holmes turned slightly. "Miss Pembroke, you are your uncle's nearest living relative?" "Yes, and recently named principal beneficiary in his amended will." The room grew very still. Clara's composure did not falter, but her eyes flickered briefly toward her uncle. "Yes," she said evenly. "That is correct." Holmes nodded. "Mr. Rowan," he continued, shifting his attention, "as private secretary you manage much of Sir Alister's correspondence and affairs?" "I do," Rowan replied. "You had anticipated advancement under the former arrangement." Rowan hesitated. I had hoped, he said carefully, to be entrusted with greater responsibility. Responsibility or inheritance? Holmes asked mildly. Rowan's face colored faintly. I am no relative, he said quickly. No, Holmes agreed, but influence may sometimes serve as currency more effectively than coin. Sir Alistair's gaze sharpened. Holmes then turned toward Edwards. You have served this household faithfully for 20 years? I have, sir, the butler replied. And your loyalty lies where it always has, with Sir Alistair. Holmes inclined his head slightly. Loyalty, he murmured, is a virtue rarely advertised by the disloyal. The tension in the room was palpable now. Holmes resumed his measured pacing. Finally, we must not overlook those who visit. Sir Alistair, you dined with Mr. Henry Collingwood the evening before the first knock. Yes, Sir Alistair answered. He is a business associate. Was the dinner amicable? Sir Alistair paused. There was disagreement. Of what nature? Investment decisions. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. And Mr. Collingwood's financial standing? Precarious, Sir Alistair admitted quietly. He has pressed me repeatedly for additional support. I saw the faintest tightening of Rowan's posture at this revelation. Holmes clasped his hands behind his back. Let us consider, he said calmly, what the knocking achieves. No one answered. It introduces doubt, Holmes continued. Repeated, precise disturbance, always at the same hour. A suggestion not of violence, but of something unexplainable. If allowed to continue, such events erode certainty. They invite speculation. They weaken confidence. In what? Clara asked quietly. In perception, Holmes replied. Sir Alistair's expression darkened. You imply someone seeks to undermine me. I imply, Holmes said evenly, that fear is most effective when it appears irrational. Rowan shifted again. Surely you do not suggest, he began, that any of us... I suggest nothing, Holmes interrupted gently. I observe only that the phenomenon requires access to this house and knowledge of its habits. It is no random intrusion from the street. He stopped pacing and looked at each of them in turn. The knock does not seek to enter, he said softly. It seeks to disturb. The words settled heavily. Clara folded her hands tightly in her lap. You believe, she said after a moment, that someone wishes to drive my uncle to doubt his own senses. Holmes's gaze met hers. I believe someone wishes others to doubt them. A silence followed that felt far longer than it was. Sir Alistair rose slowly. If this is some scheme, he said, it will be uncovered. Holmes gave a faint, almost reassuring nod. Indeed it will. The circle had been drawn, 5 individuals, 1 house, 1 precise disturbance repeated with unnatural consistency, and as I observed them, host, niece, secretary, servant, and absent associate, I could not escape the sense that beneath the civility and polished manners lay private ambitions not yet spoken aloud. The phantom knock had done its work. It had unsettled the house, and now it had confined us within suspicion. That evening, we remained at Ashcombe Terrace by Holmes's request. Sir Alistair ordered a modest supper, though I observed that none at the table ate with much appetite. Conversation drifted awkwardly from harmless topics to abrupt silence. The clock upon the mantel seemed louder than usual, marking each passing minute with unnecessary authority. Holmes, by contrast, appeared entirely at ease. He ate sparingly, spoke little, and from time to time consulted his watch with quiet precision. If tension weighed upon the household, it did not burden him. On the contrary, he seemed invigorated by the tightening strands of the problem. At 11, the servants withdrew. Clara excused herself shortly thereafter, though not before casting a brief, uncertain glance toward the front hall. Rowan lingered a moment longer, offering Sir Alistair reassurances about the irrational nature of the disturbance. It is likely nothing more than contraction in the woodwork, he insisted. Holmes looked up mildly. Wood that contracts to the minute, he asked. Rowan gave a strained smile. Unusual, perhaps, but not impossible. Holmes did not argue further. By midnight, only Sir Alistair, Holmes and I remained seated in the drawing room. The lamps had been lowered. The house felt suspended, waiting. Holmes stood and moved toward the hall once more. "Permit me," he said quietly. He examined the door again, running his fingers along the molding, then stepping into the study. He left the door to the drawing room slightly ajar, as though calculating angles invisible to the rest of us. I joined him in the study. "Holmes," I whispered, "you appear less concerned with who and more with when." He smiled faintly. "Time, my dear Watson, is the most reliable accomplice. Humans err. Mechanisms do not. You believe it mechanical still? I believe repetition at identical intervals rarely originates from impulse." He checked his watch again. 12:28. We returned to the hall. Sir Alistair stood rigid near the base of the staircase. The silence deepened. The clock began to chime the half-hour. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and as the final chime faded, 3 knocks, perfectly spaced, identical force. Neither hurried nor hesitant, Sir Alistair started despite himself. Holmes did not. He did not rush to the door. Instead, he stood perfectly still, listening not merely to the knock, but to what followed it. Nothing. No retreating footstep, no movement of air. After a moment, he opened the door slowly. Empty. He closed it just as slowly. Then he did something unexpected. He stepped into the study immediately adjacent to the hall. "Watson," he called softly. I followed. Holmes positioned himself beside the wall that bordered the entry hall. He tapped it lightly. "Strike the door," he instructed. I did so from the hallway. The sound carried through the wood clearly. Holmes nodded. "Now wait." He moved toward a section of paneling near the baseboard, one I had noticed him examine earlier. He pressed gently upon it. There was the faintest give. "Curious," he murmured. Sir Alistair appeared in the doorway behind us. "You suspect something concealed?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he crouched and placed his ear against the panel. "The knock," he said quietly, "does not echo outward alone. It resonates inward." "Inward?" Sir Alistair repeated. Holmes stood. "Sir Alistair, at precisely what hour do you retire?" "Usually by 11. "And Mr. Rowan?" "Shortly after." Holmes's gaze sharpened slightly. "And your niece?" "She keeps irregular hours." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Then the pattern is deliberate." He turned to me. "Watson, consider, if one wished to produce a disturbance nightly, without being seen near the door, one would require 2 conditions: proximity to structure and certainty of timing. You believe the knock is triggered from within. I believe it originates closer than the street." Sir Alistair frowned. "But how could such a thing be achieved?" Holmes's eyes lingered once more upon the paneling. "By exploiting what every house possesses," he said softly. "Hollow space." The notion seemed to unsettle Sir Alistair more than the knock itself. "You think someone is concealed?" he asked. "No," Holmes replied calmly. "Not concealed. Positioned." The distinction was subtle, but unmistakable. He straightened and glanced once more at his watch. "midnight precisely," he said. "No variation, no hesitation. The consistency speaks louder than the sound itself." "And what does it say?" I asked. Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. "It says the event is not spontaneous. It is controlled. The drawing room beyond us felt less secure than it had earlier. The house, once solid and unquestioned, now seemed layered, its walls holding more than warmth and shelter. The knock was not random, it was scheduled, and schedules, Holmes had often reminded me, are rarely maintained without purpose. The phantom disturbance had revealed its first truth. It obeyed time, and anything that obeys time may be traced back to a human hand. We returned to Baker Street the following afternoon at Holmes's insistence. Sir Alistair had urged us to remain another night, but Holmes declined with unusual firmness. "The answer," he said as our cab turned into Baker Street, "will not be found solely in Belgravia. It has already announced itself here." The mist had returned, though less heavily than before. The facade of 221B stood as it always had, narrow, unassuming, faintly weathered by years of London soot. If one did not know better, one might assume the events of the previous night had left no mark upon it. Holmes mounted the stairs swiftly and entered our sitting room without removing his coat. His energy had sharpened into something almost boyish, an excitement born not of danger, but of discovery waiting to be confirmed. "Watson," he said, setting down his gloves, "we shall conduct a small experiment." "I begin to feel like an assistant in your laboratory," I replied. "You are a most competent assistant," he said lightly. He crossed at once to the door of our sitting room and examined it anew. His fingers traced the grain of the wood, then moved along the frame. He tapped gently near the hinges, then along the panels. "Stand in the corridor," he instructed. I complied, stepping out onto the landing. "Strike the door," he called. I rapped 3 times, firmly, evenly. The sound carried cleanly into the room. "Again," Holmes said. This time I varied the spacing. The difference was noticeable. Holmes opened the door and joined me on the landing. He positioned himself beside the wall that separated our sitting room from the neighboring building. "Now," he said, "strike here." He indicated a section of wall just beside the door frame. I tapped lightly. The sound was dull. "Harder," I obliged. The resonance changed. Holmes smiled faintly. "Sound is a traveler, Watson. It obeys pathways we rarely consider." He stepped back into the sitting room and closed the door. "Now remain outside and listen." I did so. From within, Holmes tapped against something, though not the door itself. To my surprise, the sound that reached me was astonishingly similar to the knock we had heard the previous night. 3 measured raps, perfectly spaced. I opened the door at once. Holmes stood beside the wall adjacent to the doorframe, his knuckles poised against a narrow section of paneling. "You see?" he said quietly. "You were not striking the door." "No, but the sound appeared to originate there." He nodded. "The human ear is remarkably obedient to expectation. When one hears a knock, one assumes the door. Rarely does one consider that vibration may travel laterally." He crouched and tapped again, this time lower, near the baseboard. The effect was subtler but still convincing. "In older constructions," he continued, "voids between beams and panels may act as conduits. A knock delivered at one point may resonate convincingly at another. You believe the Belgravia house possesses similar architecture. I would stake my reputation upon it." Holmes rose and paced once across the room. "Consider the pattern," he said. "The knock occurs at midnight. No variation, no accompanying footsteps, no disturbance of air, no mechanical scraping from the exterior. You suspect someone within the house," I said slowly, "is producing the sound from an adjoining room." "Precisely, and allowing it to resonate as though struck upon the door." Holmes inclined his head. "But to what end?" He paused before answering. "To unsettle," he said. "Not violently, not dramatically, but gradually." He moved toward the mantel and checked the clock. "In Belgravia," he continued, "the study lies adjacent to the entry hall. The paneling near the baseboard displayed subtle resonance when tapped. If hollow space exists behind it, then a strike from within the study, I finished, could mimic a knock at the front door." Holmes's eyes brightened. "Exactly. And the timing?" "A clock," he said simply. "I considered this. You believe someone waits in the study at precisely midnight and strikes the panel, or arranges for it to be struck?" Holmes replied thoughtfully. "But the precision suggests human oversight." He crossed once more to our own door and tapped lightly again, reproducing the sound. Even knowing its origin, I felt the faintest chill at how convincingly it imitated the earlier disturbance. Holmes straightened. "The phantom," he said quietly, "is architectural and human," I added. "Yes." He returned to his chair and sat at last, though not in boredom. "The question," he said, "is not whether the knock is mechanical. It is who benefits from its effect." I took my seat opposite him. "The beneficiaries are few," I said. "Sir Alister's household." Holmes nodded slowly. "A closed circle, Watson." The phrase lingered in the room. Outside, a carriage passed, ordinary and unremarkable. The city continued unaware. But within 221B, the illusion of haunting had already begun to dissolve. The knock, stripped of superstition, revealed itself as something far more familiar, and far more troubling. Not a spirit, not a prank, but intention traveling quietly through wood and wall, and somewhere within that quiet intention lay motive. We returned to Ashcombe Terrace the following evening, this time with Holmes carrying a small leather case of instruments, which he rarely displayed unless confident of structural discovery. Sir Alistair received us with visible impatience, hope strained thin by repeated disturbance. "You have found something?" he asked at once. "I have found possibility," Holmes replied. "Tonight we determined certainty. The household had been instructed to retire early." Holmes insisted that no one remain near the entry hall after 11 save ourselves and Sir Alistair. The lamps were lowered. The air felt heavy with expectation. Holmes wasted no time. He moved directly into the study adjoining the hall and knelt beside the panel he had previously examined. From his case he withdrew a slim steel probe and a narrow-handled screwdriver. "Sir Alistair," he said calmly, "I trust you will forgive minor disruption." "If it yields explanation," Pembroke replied, "you may dismantle the entire wall." Holmes inserted the probe gently into the narrow seam between two panels near the baseboard. He applied light pressure. The wood gave ever so slightly. "Observe," he murmured. With careful precision, he loosened two concealed screws hidden within the molding. The panel shifted outward with minimal resistance. Behind it lay darkness. Not brick, not solid beam, empty space. Sir Alistair drew a slow breath. Holmes leaned closer, raising a small lantern to illuminate the cavity. It extended several feet inward, narrow but deliberate, an architectural void between structural supports, and within that hollow space, a thin cord. It ran vertically through the cavity, disappearing upward toward the ceiling and then laterally toward the hallway wall. Holmes did not speak immediately. He followed the cord gently with his fingers. "Remarkable," he said softly. "What is it?" I asked. "A transmission line." Sir Alistair stared in disbelief. "Transmission of what?" Holmes rose and stepped into the hall. He positioned himself beside the front door and examined the inner paneling closely. Near the center, concealed within decorative carving, was a small wooden peg, nearly indistinguishable from ornament. Holmes pressed it. A muted thud answered from the door. He pressed again, more firmly. 3 controlled raps reverberated through the wood, identical in tone, identical in force. Sir Alistair staggered back a step. "You mean to say," he whispered, "that the knock is produced from within this house?" Holmes finished calmly. He returned to the open panel in the study and tugged gently upon the cord. The peg near the door trembled slightly. "Crude, yet effective," Holmes observed. "A simple cord and lever mechanism. When pulled from the study, it strikes the inner panel of the door with controlled force." "But why conceal it?" I asked. Holmes looked thoughtful. "It was likely installed recently." Sir Alistair shook his head slowly. "This house has stood unchanged for decades." Holmes examined the wood around the cavity. "Unchanged in appearance," he corrected. "The screws are newer, the varnish along this seam slightly fresher." Sir Alistair's composure wavered. "You mean someone in my house constructed this?" "Yes, and struck it each night?" "At precisely midnight. The implications settled heavily upon the room. Holmes closed the panel loosely, but did not secure it. "We shall leave it as found," he said quietly. "The perpetrator must believe the mechanism undiscovered." Sir Alistair's voice trembled slightly. "Holmes, who would do such a thing?" Holmes stood slowly. "Someone," he said, "who benefits not from entry, but from erosion." "Erosion?" "Of confidence, of stability, of reputation." Sir Alistair's face paled. "If such knocks continued, if neighbors heard, they would question your composure," Holmes finished. "They might whisper." Holmes's eyes hardened subtly. "This is not mischief, it is strategy." I looked once more into the hollow cavity, at the thin cord running silently through darkness. It was not elaborate machinery, no complex clockwork, only a simple device, hidden cleverly within the bones of the house. And yet its effect had been profound. Holmes extinguished the lantern. "Tonight," he said calmly, "we shall see who comes to pull the cord." The hall felt altered now, not haunted, but exposed. The phantom had acquired a body, not spirit, but string, not mystery, but mechanism. And somewhere within these walls, a hand waited for midnight. Holmes did not accuse Rowan immediately. That, I believe, was deliberate. Instead, he asked Sir Alistair to summon the household once more. The panel remained loosened but concealed. The cord lay untouched within the wall, waiting. We assembled in the drawing room. Rowan entered last. His composure appeared intact, but only outwardly. There was a tightness at the corners of his mouth that had not been present earlier. Clara noticed it. So did Holmes. Holmes spoke calmly. "The disturbance has been traced," he said. Rowan's gaze flickered. Just once. Sir Alistair's voice was steady. "Traced." "To design," Holmes replied. Silence thickened. Holmes continued, not toward accusation, but toward observation. "The knock is not intended to frighten. It is intended to repeat." Clara frowned slightly. "Repeat what?" "Uncertainty." Rowan shifted in his seat. Holmes began pacing slowly. "A single unexplained event may be dismissed. A second invites concern. A third invites discussion." He stopped, and discussion, once begun, spreads. Sir Alistair's expression hardened. "You believe someone wishes me discussed?" Holmes met his gaze evenly. "I believe someone wishes your judgment questioned." The words settled heavily. Rowan rose suddenly. "This is absurd," he said. "You speak as though there were conspiracy in the walls." Holmes's tone did not change. "There is." The room went still. Holmes turned toward the study door. "Mr. Rowan," he said gently, "if you would be so kind." Rowan did not move. Holmes stepped into the study himself and removed the panel. The cord lay visible. The illusion died instantly. Clara drew a sharp breath. Sir Alistair stared at the exposed mechanism as though it was something indecent. Rowan's face drained of color. For several seconds, no one spoke. Holmes did not rush the silence. "You installed it?" he said quietly. It was not a question. Rowan swallowed. You measured the hour carefully," Holmes continued. "midnight. Late enough for imagination to stir, early enough to be remembered." Rowan's voice trembled. "It was not meant to harm. It was meant to weaken," Holmes corrected softly. Rowan's composure fractured. "You changed the will," he said abruptly to Sir Alistair. "Without warning, without explanation." Sir Alistair's expression shifted. Not anger first, but something closer to disappointment. "You could have asked," he said quietly, "and risked refusal." Rowan shot back. The desperation in his voice was no longer disguised. Holmes observed him carefully. "Desperation," he said, "often chooses subtlety over confrontation." Rowan looked almost relieved to hear the words spoken. "I gave years to this house," he said, more quietly now, "and overnight I became replaceable." There it was, not greed alone, fear. Holmes nodded slightly, but did not soften. Fear does not justify deception. Rowan lowered his head, but Holmes was not finished. "This design," he continued calmly, "exceeds personal resentment." Rowan's eyes flickered upward. "You did not conceive this alone." Silence. And that silence spoke louder than any confession. Holmes did not press further until Collingwood arrived. The tension in the hall sharpened when he entered. He sensed something had shifted before a word was spoken. "What has happened?" Collingwood asked, irritation masking unease. Holmes answered before Sir Alistair could. "Your mechanism has been discovered." Collingwood did not immediately deny it. That, perhaps, was the first true confession. Holmes spoke calmly. "The brilliance of your strategy was restraint. No violence, no vandalism, only repetition." Collingwood's jaw tightened. "It was symbolic." "No," Holmes said quietly. "It was surgical." He stepped closer. "You understood that instability need not be proven, only suggested." Sir Alistair's gaze hardened. "You intended others to doubt me." Collingwood exhaled slowly. "Markets doubt everything," he said. "I merely accelerated the process." Holmes studied him. "You required time." Collingwood did not answer. "You required contracts delayed, decisions reconsidered, confidence shaken." Rowan spoke quietly. It was meant to create hesitation. Collingwood shot him a sharp glance. Holmes noticed. And hesitation, Holmes said calmly, once introduced, multiplies. Servants whisper, neighbors speculate, investors hesitate. Clara's voice trembled, though controlled. You would have allowed that. Collingwood's composure thinned. I would have allowed doubt. Holmes's tone cooled. Doubt, when planted deliberately, is indistinguishable from sabotage. Collingwood met his gaze at last. You speak as though survival is a sin. Holmes did not blink. Survival purchased through erosion rarely sustains. The room held its breath. Rowan spoke again, this time not in defense, but in realization. It would have spread, he murmured. Holmes nodded. Yes, there was no triumph in his voice, only inevitability. The illusion had collapsed, but the greater unraveling lay in what followed. Sir Alistair stood straighter now, not restored but steadied. You believed me weak, he said quietly. Collingwood did not answer immediately. I believed you rigid, he said at last, inflexible, indifferent to consequence. That struck deeper than accusation. Sir Alistair's expression shifted, not defensive but reflective. Holmes observed the exchange with keen interest. So, Holmes said softly, this was not merely ambition. No, Collingwood admitted, it was pressure. Financial? Yes, Holmes folded his hands. Then we approached truth. Collingwood's voice lowered. Had your name faltered, even slightly, boards would hesitate, contracts would pause. I could have restructured before collapse. And in the process, Holmes said quietly, you would have risked permanent damage to a man who trusted you. Collingwood's silence confirmed more than denial. Rowan spoke in a subdued tone. We did not think it would spread. Holmes regarded him steadily. Such designs rarely remain contained. The house felt different now, not haunted but exposed. Sir Alistair looked between them. You might have spoken to me. Collingwood's voice was steady but subdued. And if you refused? Holmes answered for him. Then refusal would have been honest. Silence followed. Holmes stepped toward the panel once more and closed it firmly. A cord, he said quietly, is not dangerous. He looked up, but intention is. Rowan's shoulders sagged completely. Collingwood's confidence, once sharp, dulled into weary acceptance. Sir Alistair spoke at last. I will not summon the police. Both men looked up sharply. But our association ends here. It was not anger that filled the hall. It was disappointment, and that weighed more heavily than accusation. Holmes adjusted his gloves. The phantom, he said softly, was never a spirit. He paused. It was opportunity disguised as mystery. In the quiet that followed, the weight of the deception settled fully, not theatrical, not explosive, but deeply human. Holmes insisted that one final demonstration take place. Exposure is not explanation, he said quietly. Explanation must be witnessed. Sir Alistair agreed without hesitation. If anything, I sensed in him a desire to see the illusion collapse fully publicly, beyond denial. Thus, it was arranged that the household, including Mr. Rowan and Mr. Collingwood, remain assembled in the entry hall shortly before midnight. The lamps were set at moderate brightness. No shadows deep enough to conceal movement remained. The study door stood open, the loosened panel visible. The cord had been returned to its original position. Holmes stood near the staircase, watch in hand. Sir Alistair positioned himself beside the front door. Clara stood upright beside him, pale but composed. Edwards remained near the wall, hands folded, expression stern. Rowan and Collingwood stood opposite one another, each avoiding the other's gaze. The hall felt colder than the air warranted. Holmes glanced at his watch. 12:28, he said quietly. No one spoke. The ticking of the clock seemed unnaturally loud. Holmes turned slightly toward Rowan. Mr. Rowan, he said calmly, please step into the study. Rowan hesitated only a fraction of a second before complying. Holmes followed him inside, gesturing for the others to remain where they stood. Watson, that is, I remained in the doorway, positioned so that both study and hall were visible. Holmes stood beside the exposed panel. At precisely midnight, he said clearly enough for all to hear, Mr. Rowan would ordinarily pull this cord. Rowan's jaw tightened. Holmes checked his watch again. 12:29. He turned to Rowan. Pull it. Rowan looked at Sir Alistair, then at Collingwood. Neither spoke. Holmes's tone sharpened slightly. Pull it. Rowan reached into the cavity and grasped the cord. The second hand swept forward. midnight. Rowan pulled. 3 knocks rang through the hall. Firm, even, identical to every prior disturbance. The sound, stripped of mystery, seemed smaller now, almost hollow. Sir Alistair did not flinch this time. Clara did not start. No one moved toward the door. The knock had lost its power. Holmes stepped into the hall. You see, he said evenly, there is no phantom. He walked to the front door and struck it lightly with his knuckles. The resonance differed, subtly but perceptibly. Observe the distinction, he said. A true knock upon the exterior produces outward vibration. This mechanism produces internal reverberation. He returned to the study and pulled the cord himself. 3 knocks again. Identical. Precision, he said calmly, without presence. Sir Alistair spoke quietly. And repetition created belief. Yes, Holmes replied. He turned toward Collingwood. Your design relied upon the authority of pattern. Humans trust consistency. We mistake repetition for legitimacy. Collingwood's composure had thinned to transparency. It was temporary, he muttered. Holmes met his gaze steadily. You never think corrosion escalates. That is its nature. Silence settled again. Holmes closed the panel firmly this time and tightened the screws with deliberate finality. There will be no further disturbances, he said quietly. The hall felt altered, not because the sound had ceased, but because its illusion had been dismantled in plain sight. Sir Alistair stepped forward. I trusted you both, he said evenly to Rowan and Collingwood. You chose deception. Neither replied. Holmes addressed the room. Fear is rarely as powerful as suggestion. Once explanation is seen, fear evaporates. He moved toward the door and opened it. The street beyond lay quiet. Mist clung faintly to the pavement, but no spectre waited there. Holmes closed the door gently. The phantom, he said softly, was never outside. The weight that had lingered in the house for days seemed to lift. No more suspense. No more waiting for midnight. Only exposed ambition and fractured trust remained. And yet, in that exposure, something else returned. Clarity. The knock, once deliberate and unsettling, now felt reduced to nothing more than wood striking wood. The mind, once freed from uncertainty, refuses to be haunted. Holmes checked his watch once more and slipped it back into his pocket. Midnight, he said calmly, has surrendered its mystery, and in that quiet hall beneath steady lamplight, the illusion dissolved completely. The demonstration had ended, but its consequences lingered. No one dispersed immediately. The hall remained filled with silence, not the uneasy silence of uncertainty, but the heavier quiet that follows exposure. Sir Alistair was the first to move. He stepped away from the door and faced Rowan and Collingwood directly. His voice, when he spoke, was neither raised nor trembling. I gave you trust. The simplicity of the words gave them weight. Rowan lowered his eyes. Collingwood held Sir Alistair's gaze a moment longer before looking aside. Holmes remained still, hands loosely clasped behind his back. He had no need to press further. The illusion had collapsed. Truth required no theatrics. It began as conversation, Collingwood said at last, the polish gone from his tone. Markets are sensitive, reputations fragile. I merely observed that hesitation can influence decisions. Rowan spoke without lifting his head. I was desperate. Years of service, and then the will changed without warning. I feared dismissal, obscurity. Holmes raised a hand gently. The origin of suggestion matters less than the choice to execute it. Clara's voice remained steady, though her eyes betrayed hurt. Fear does not justify deception. Rowan did not respond. Sir Alistair regarded him for a long moment. You could have spoken to me. Rowan said nothing. Holmes stepped forward slightly. There is courage in direct appeal. There is none in concealed manipulation. Sir Alistair turned toward Collingwood. You were prepared to see my name questioned publicly. I was prepared to survive, Collingwood replied, though without conviction. Holmes met his gaze evenly. Survival purchased through the erosion of another's standing is rarely stable. The hall, moments ago a stage for phantom disturbance, now felt like a courtroom without robes. Clara moved closer to her uncle. This house has never known scandal, she said quietly. You would have introduced it through suggestion alone. Collingwood did not deny it. Sir Alistair drew a slow breath. I will not summon the police, he said at last, but your positions here are ended. Rowan closed his eyes briefly, accepting what he had already understood. Collingwood straightened, some fragment of pride returning. You would sever decades of association. Sir Alistair's gaze did not waver. You severed them first. Silence followed. Holmes stepped back toward the staircase. The matter, he said calmly, is resolved. Clara looked at him. Resolved? The illusion is dismantled, Holmes replied. Trust is not so easily repaired. There was no judgment in his tone, only fact. Edwards, who had remained silent throughout, finally spoke. I have served this house faithfully, and I shall continue to do so. Sir Alistair inclined his head. You have my gratitude. Rowan moved toward the door slowly, almost mechanically. Collingwood followed, stiffer in bearing. Neither spoke again. When the outer door closed behind them, the house seemed to exhale. The phantom knock that had unsettled these walls night after night had been reduced to wood, cord, and misjudged ambition. Yet what lingered was not fear. It was the recognition that harm need not be loud to be profound. Holmes adjusted his gloves. Human frailty, he said softly, almost to himself, is the most reliable architect of illusion. Sir Alistair met his gaze. I am indebted to you, Mr. Holmes. Holmes inclined his head. You are indebted only to clarity. The house stood intact. No spectre had breached its door, but betrayal had passed through it nonetheless, and in its wake remained not dread but disappointment, heavier than any midnight knock. We returned to Baker Street just as dawn began to loosen its hold upon the night. London at that hour feels unfinished. The lamps burn though daylight gathers. The streets breathe but do not yet speak. It is a time between certainties. Holmes sat in silence during the journey home, not fatigued, for he rarely appeared so, but contemplative. His gaze rested upon the passing streets, though I knew his thoughts remained in Belgravia. When we entered 221B, the room greeted us with its familiar steadiness. The fire was revived. The kettle sang faintly upon the hob. The ordinary rituals of return resumed their quiet authority. And yet the night lingered. Holmes removed his gloves with deliberate care and crossed to the violin. He did not play at once. Instead, he stood looking at it, as though weighing whether music were appropriate after such a revelation. You are dissatisfied, I said at last. He glanced at me faintly. Not dissatisfied, he replied. Reflective. I poured tea. The mechanism was simple, I said. Almost disappointing. Holmes allowed the faintest smile. Simplicity is rarely disappointing, Watson. It is efficient. But the motive was not. No, he agreed. It seldom is. He accepted the cup. For several nights, he said quietly, a household listened to a sound that appeared beyond its control. The mind resents what it cannot locate. When explanation fails, it turns inward. You mean it begins to doubt itself? Precisely. He leaned back slightly. Repetition without source unsettles the strongest temperaments. It invites questions the mind cannot answer. And that was the true design, I said. Yes, he stirred his tea absently. A reputation may take decades to construct, he said quietly. A whisper may undermine it in days. The statement lingered. He did not fear spirits, I said, thinking of Sir Alistair beneath his staircase. He feared perception, Holmes corrected gently. He rose and moved toward our own front door, placing his hand upon the panel where the first knock had sounded. A knock is a request for acknowledgement, he said thoughtfully. It demands response. When response yields nothing, uncertainty grows, and uncertainty is difficult to endure. It unsettles even disciplined minds. He tapped lightly upon the wood once, twice, 3 times. The sound echoed plainly. Now, he said, there is no mystery in it. The difference lay not in the sound, but in its explanation. Holmes returned to his chair and lifted the violin. A slow, measured melody filled the room. Not dramatic, not mournful, but contemplative. The deception succeeded, he continued between phrases, not because it was complex, but because it was subtle. Subtlety invites imagination to participate, and imagination rarely chooses restraint, I said. He smiled faintly. No, it prefers drama. The music softened. The phantom knock, he said quietly, was never about entry. No, it was about influence. He allowed the final note to fade into the morning air. I looked once more toward the door. It appeared unchanged, solid, ordinary, reliable. Yet I understood how easily certainty may be unsettled when doubt is introduced with patience. The knock had ceased. The cord had been removed. The illusion dismantled. What remained was clarity. Holmes lowered the violin and placed it carefully upon the chair. Outside, daylight claimed the street entirely. Within 221B, the mystery had dissolved not in spectacle, but in reason. And that was enough.